Carmody to come on in and introduce our guests, if you would, please. Thank you, Stuart, very much. God bless you.
Good afternoon. I'm so thrilled we have one of our cherished patriots of America here today. And she is a former state prosecutor, and she's a constitutional attorney. She is a fabulous radio host, so she gets up early every morning, I believe, and hosts her radio show. And she's a Russian linguist. She's a veteran of the U.S. Army, and she's a pastor's wife, and most importantly, she's a mom. And her mission is to teach America about the Constitution. And we're thrilled to have her today, and hopefully you'll return tomorrow to get her full seminar on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Please give a big round of applause for KrisAnne.
All right, thank you so much. I don't do well with podiums and microphone stands because I wander around a little bit, and I'm not very graceful. So I do want to thank you for coming out today. Wow, look at all the dead things on the walls. That's really cool. I just want to say to you, what in the world? What in the world is your Senate thinking? This electoral college thing. I'm just sitting here. I can't even believe what I'm hearing. That is complete insanity. Whoever sponsors and co-sponsors that bill, they just identified themselves as somebody who needs a pink slip. Let me sum up this electoral college thing for you as simple as I can. The framers of this nation gave us electoral college so we wouldn't be a democracy.
Yeah.
You get rid of the electoral college, you're a democracy. That's it. Problem is, we don't know what that means anymore. See, I travel around the country and I teach things that haven't been taught for decades. And I correct things that have been taught wrong for decades. And so what we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to go through this history that I'm going to give you a preview to today. And we're going to walk through the Bill of Rights as well, 1 through 10 and the 17th Amendment. I'm going to tell you why the first is first. I'm going to tell you why 2, 3, and 4 have to work together or they don't work at all. I'm going to show you why shall not be infringed actually means shall not be infringed, and it's not, the only place is not the Second Amendment. I'm going to tell you what our framers said about who a militia was. I'm going to explain to you why 5, 7, and 8 should operate together. And if you don't have one, you don't have any. Anybody ever notice that 9 and 10 look completely different than the first 8? That's on purpose. There's a reason for that. Right off, let me ask you, who can tell me, what do you think? I'm laughing because I know where I am. What do you think the most important clause in the entire Constitution and Bill of Rights is?
We the people.
No. No. The 9th Amendment. The 9th Amendment is the most important statement in both the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The 9th Amendment is what declares that all the rights in the universe belong to the people. It is what makes us a republic and not a democracy or a kingdom. But it is the most neglected part of our Constitution and Bill of Rights, the most forgotten. And so tomorrow we're going to get into this in some really great detail. But I want to teach you today a few things so you can see where we come from, where we're headed, and what our solutions must be. For example, some things that we need to know. Someone please tell me, when did women get the right to vote in America? What year? Just shout out. 1913?
1920.
1920? No. The truth of the matter is we are taught, generally speaking, that it's around 1919, 1920 during a women's suffrage movement. But the truth of the matter is women always had the right to vote in America. There is nothing in the Constitution that ever prohibited women from voting. Women voted until 1807, when corrupt politicians on the state level started monkeying with who could vote and who couldn't vote so that they could consolidate power to themselves. Sound familiar?
Yep.
Who can tell me was the first man to die in the Revolutionary War? What was his name?
Crispus Attucks.
Crispus Attucks, right. Crispus Attucks was a freed slave who had become a whaler for the merchant marines. He was on his ship one day and heard an alarm go off. When the alarm went off, he ran up deck to put out the fire, because that's usually what an alarm meant, only he found out there was no fire, but that his own government had picked up arms against his own people. Crispus Attucks ran back below deck, got 55 of his shipmates, came out and gave his life, so that you and I could sit in this room. So that we had the right to keep and bear arms. So that we had the right to pray to God. And even complain about the government. And not worry about stormtroopers coming through the door to arrest us. There's a poem written about Crispus Attucks in his day by a man named John Boyle O'Reilly. Honor to Crispus Attucks, who was leader and voice that day, the first to defy and the first to die, with maverick car and gray. Call it riot or revolution, his hand first clenched to the crown. His feet were the first in perilous place to pull the king's flag down. His breast was the first one rent apart, that liberty's stream might flow. For our freedom now and forever, his head was first laid low. Call it riot or revolution or mob or crowd as you may. Such deaths have been seed of nations. Such lives shall be honored for aye. Raise your hand and keep it up for just a second if this is the first time you've ever heard of Crispus Attucks. Look around. Does it look like we're doing a very good job of honoring Crispus Attucks forever? Ever heard of a guy? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of a man named Ned Hector. Ned Hector was another freed slave who fought in the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. When his unit was given the order to retreat, he refused. So the enemy shall not have my team. I will save the horses or perish myself. He ended up getting a Medal of Honor from George Washington. See, the truth of the matter is there were battalions of freed slaves who fought in our Revolutionary War. There were provisions in the states that said if you are a slave and you want to fight for liberty, you are now a free man forever. But you see, I don't think we don't teach that. I know we don't teach that, but I don't think we seriously think about that. Because what that means to us is this, that there are some men who gave their only free breath so that we could sit in this room today. Lift up praise and prayer to God. Know that we have a right to keep and bear arms, and criticize the government and not live in fear. Now, I know that you have heard that we have certain groups who defend the Constitution in this country who are called racist. But I'm sorry, I don't think that term is appropriately applied. Because I can't think of anything more racist than our government school system that denies these men their honor.
Yes.
But why do they do that? Well, because we have to perpetrate a lie about the Constitution so that we can declare it to be irrelevant, to be antiquated. So that we can perpetrate this idea that the Constitution was written by a bunch of rich white guys who hated everybody but themselves and their money. Because since you can't attack the Constitution with history and fact, you have to attack it with lies and name-calling. You see, we teach our children that the Constitution was invented, liberty, it was invented in 1776, or that the Constitution itself was written in 1787. And therefore, we can uphold these ideas that, our framers couldn't possibly know what we are seeing today. They couldn't know anything about internet or Facebook or Twitter. And since they don't know about nuclear weapons, then they can't have possibly meant what they really said in the Constitution. And since we're so technologically advanced today, that must mean that we're intellectually superior than we were back then. And it's up to us to redefine the terms so that we can make a better document that's fundamentally flawed. But you see, that's not true. All of that is a tool to undermine the principles of liberty and change the constitutional republic into a totalitarian kingdom. We have got to be about reclaiming this truth. We have got to be about understanding liberty, because if you cannot define it, you cannot defend it. But tyranny is the same way. If you cannot define tyranny, you can't defeat it either. Dick Durbin said the other day, what is press? He says, we know Fox, we know AP, we know their press. But are bloggers press? Are tweeters press? He said, we need to ask 21st century questions about a document that was written 200 years ago. My response is, hey Dick, it's the First Amendment. I don't need to be government approved. That's the whole point. But we have lost sight of some very important basics. Very basic things. Last year, I taught 265 lessons in 22 states. 22 of those lessons taught to high school, middle school, college campuses. I asked our young people who fought in the Revolutionary War. Inevitably, they tell me the Americans and the British. The problem was there were no Americans in the Revolutionary War. But we teach our children that it was fought between the Americans and the British so we can play it up as a foreign war and relate it to what we're doing today. But it was not a foreign war, it was a civil war. It was British citizens fighting their British government. And by the way, it wasn't a revolution per se, it was a restoration. You see, we weren't revolting against anything. It was the king who had revolted against their constitutional charter. We were trying to restore liberty. But you see, in order to understand where our Constitution comes from, you have to understand that we didn't invent it. That our framers came to this continent with their own constitutional charter, and our Constitution itself is modeled after that. You see, the colonies were inhabited by British citizens. Even Thomas Paine would say that they were a melting pot even in 1776. He said so in Common Sense. But you see, once you came here, regardless of where you came from, you became a British citizen. Right? So let me ask you something. If you drive to Kansas, are you now subject to Kansas law? Right? If you pack up your house and leave Oklahoma and move and build a house in Kansas, are you now not a citizen of Oklahoma but now a citizen of Kansas? That's how it worked. No matter where you left, when you came and moved to the colonies, you became a British citizen because the colonies were owned by Great Britain. You became the subject to a king. Patrick Henry said, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past. Alexander Hamilton said, experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred and conclusive. How many of you heard that saying, those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it? That's what we're taught, but that's not true. Ever heard of a guy named Solomon? He said there's nothing new under the sun. You see, history always repeats itself. But those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. And that's exactly what we're doing. And that will be undeniable before you leave this room. Guaranteed. You see, if we're going to understand our Constitution, we're going to have to understand where our liberty came from. John Adams said, liberty must be supported at all hazards. Notice he said liberty. He didn't say health care. But since truth is an equal opportunity offender, he didn't say your Social Security either. And he didn't say your job or your home. He said your liberty must be supported at all hazards, because without liberty you would have none of those things. He said liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker. How many of you have heard of a principle called natural law? Natural law teaches that we are created in the image of God. And since we are created in the image of God, we've inherited certain things from God. One thing that we've inherited from God is freedom. So raise your hand if it's your job to wake up every day and tell God how to run things. See, God has that freedom, but we inherited it, being created in His image. We haven't gotten the wisdom, and thank God we didn't get the power. But we have the freedom. We don't understand what that means, though. Because we do not want a country built on freedom alone. If we did, we'd be France. Because a country built on freedom alone means I'm free to lie, I'm free to steal, and I'm free to murder. I am free to do whatever I want to do regardless of how that hurts you. Does that sound like a nice place to live? See, freedom all by itself is anarchy. Liberty and freedom are not the same thing. Liberty is freedom plus morality. That shared morality that understands I am free to lie, I am free to steal, and I am free to murder, but I will not because it's wrong. Can I tell you something that will make your legislators upset?
Sure.
You want to know something that makes them mad?
Go for it.
Are you ready? Laws don't stop crimes. As an attorney who spent over a decade of her life in the criminal justice system, I can tell you two things. The criminal justice system was not designed to stop crimes. It was designed to identify criminal activity and establish a mechanism to punish criminals. Because you see, if laws stopped crimes, we would be a crime-free country because we've got way too many laws. Do you know that there are only two things that will stop a man from murdering his neighbor? Because he is free to murder his neighbor anytime he wants to. But he may suffer the consequences, but you have to admit, anyone is free to murder their neighbor anytime they want to. There are only two things that will stop them. I am free to murder my neighbor anytime I want to, but I will not because it's wrong. That's what's wrong with our society, completely void of morality today. The other thing, I am free to murder my neighbor anytime I want to, but I won't because he's well armed. John Adams said, liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker, but if we had not, our fathers have bought and purchased it for us with their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. John Adams is telling us in 1765, by the way, we didn't invent liberty, we inherited it. Just how deeply did we inherit? Well, you've got to go back to 1045 to understand where our liberty came from. Now, in 1045, Great Britain was a kingdom, just like it was in 1776. But Great Britain is a unique kingdom. You see, if you live in a kingdom, that means the king holds all the power and hands out the rights as he sees fit. And if the king can hand out rights, what can he do? Take them away. Now, when you live in a kingdom, you have this cool thing called the whim of the sovereign. Ever heard this saying, it's good to be king? Or if you're Obama, it's good to be president, because he doesn't recognize the difference. Right? Okay. So, it's good to be king because you have the whim of the sovereign, which means anything you want to do, you can do it anytime you want to. Which means when you live in a kingdom and you're the subject to a king, you literally wake up every single day wondering what's right and what's wrong today because your rights and privileges can change just like that. By the way, That's why we're different from a kingdom. As a constitutional republic, you can't get any more different than a kingdom. King holds all the right, hands out the powers as he holds all the power, hands out the rights and privileges as he sees fit. In a republic, the people hold all the rights, as declared in the 9th Amendment, and delegate power to the government as they see fit. And let me ask you something. If we hold all the rights and we delegate the power, what can we do? Take the power back. That is the king thing. Do we not understand that as the holder of the powers, we have the right to take it back? Doesn't the Declaration of Independence say that when we have a government that works against liberty, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish that government? How many of you have heard this country called a democracy? See, I don't think we understand just how insidious that switch of names actually is. Otherwise, we wouldn't sort of shake our head and roll our eyes when our conservative Republicans do that, because they do. You see, there's a huge difference between a kingdom and a republic, but there's no difference between a democracy and a kingdom. Remember, in a kingdom, the king holds all the power and hands out the rights as he sees fit. In a democracy, the only difference is how many people hold the power. Jefferson said, despotism in the hands of one is no different than despotism in the hands of 174. When you live in a democracy, you're ruled by the mob. You ever heard that term, mob mentality? You know what that tells us? Mobs are fickle and stupid.
Yes.
And if you advocate for a democracy, then what you're advocating for is your rights and privileges to be ruled by the fickle and the stupid. And if the mob can hand out rights, what can they do? See, this lie has absolutely infected our minority communities, and I don't understand that. See, if I, as a member, I guess they consider me a minority woman. I am offended particularly by describing us as a democracy, because in a democracy, the minorities never have any rights or any privileges unless the mob says so. It is total mob rule. You have no rights, no privileges. If we had been a democracy, the civil rights movement would have failed. If we had been a democracy, there would have been no women's suffrage movement. Because in a democracy, the majority of the people always rule over the minorities, and they never have any rights or privileges, unless the mob gives it to them. But in 1045, Great Britain is a kingdom, and they're a unique kingdom. Because even though they have the whim of the sovereign, they have this thing called common law. It's a common set of laws based on common social standards, commonly known by all, and the theory is it's going to be commonly applied to all classes of people. Raise your hand if you think it worked out that way. Because we didn't invent corruption. But you see, in Great Britain, even though they're a kingdom, because of common law, you could wake up every day and know that some things are always right and some things are always wrong. Which means that sort of whim of the sovereign that the king thinks he has is not unlimited. There are some things that he cannot change. He cannot change common law. That's why in 1045 Great Britain is called a limited monarchy, because the king can't do whatever he wants if it goes against common law. Now the king's name in 1045 is Edward the Confessor. Edward is described as being a generous king. Edward has allowed the people to meet with their barons and lords twice a year, which is basically our legislators, because the barons and lords had some lawmaking capability. They had direct access to the king. And Edward is giving the people the right and the privilege to meet with their barons and lords and tell them the things that they like about government and the things that they don't like. Now the idea is the suggestions of the people are going to be taken to the king, and what do you suppose the king is going to do with those suggestions? Whatever he wants, right? Are kings elected?
No.
Are kings appointed?
No.
Kings are on the throne by a principle called divine right, which means God makes kings. He births men in certain families, in certain birth order, and that makes them king. And so when you're a king and you're on the throne by divine right, then you only have to answer to God. And if you're not particularly concerned with God, what God has to say, then you're really unlimited, aren't you? But you see, history doesn't prove to us that governments come to the ultimate conclusion that they should be republics and not kingdoms. That is something that the people decide. Because the truth of the matter is, every government wants to be a kingdom. Every government. How many of you are frustrated by the fact of all the power being consolidated in Washington, D.C. today? Can I tell you that that power consolidation is perfectly normal? That's exactly what governments want to do. It's what governments have always done throughout history. There's been governments wanting more power, people wanting more liberty, a tug of war, because the more power government has, the less liberty people have. So our country was actually birthed out of that very tug of war. So what our federal government is doing is perfectly natural. Do you know what's unnatural? We are not pulling back. So Edward is about to die, and he has no heirs, no sons. So when you live in a kingdom and there are no sons born, you have to go to this list of people that are next in line to be king. The next in line to be king is a man named William I. William I knows he's supposed to be king. He's getting ready to be king. Problem is, the people of Great Britain do not want William I to be king, because William I is not from Great Britain. He's from Normandy. And the people of Great Britain do not want a foreign king, because if you get a foreign king, you never know what you're going to get. And so they hatch out this plan to appoint a man named Harold to be king of Great Britain. Now it's 1065, we're not appointing kings yet, and William gets upset. William gets upset that he's being passed outside the throne. The bad news is, for the people of Great Britain, William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? He raises his Norman army, he goes over and defeats Harold and the English people, sets himself up on the throne. He is now king of Great Britain. Now when you are in line to be king, you are fully informed of the whim of the sovereign, and you know how good it's going to be king. William is ramped up and ready to be king. Only he gets to Great Britain and finds out this is not your average kingdom. This is a limited monarchy, and he doesn't have complete sovereignty. So William, being upset, sets out to fundamentally transform Great Britain. Now, if you're going to fundamentally transform a kingdom that's unique, the first thing you're going to attack is the thing that makes it unique. The thing that made Great Britain unique was the common law. So William starts replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are loyal to his ideology and not loyal to the common law. He starts using those judges to enforce his foreign law on the people of Great Britain contrary to their common law. He starts chasing the landowners off of their land through threat and force itself, sometimes literally running them completely out of the kingdom, and then seizing their abandoned land and handing it over to his foreign friends. How else do you keep foreign law in a kingdom if it's not full of people who like the foreign law better than the common law? He starts replacing the leadership in the churches with leaders who are loyal to the ideology of the king, not to the word of God, and willing to do whatever the king says, even when it's contrary to God's word. This goes on for about 40 years. William has had 4 sons. He and his first son don't get along. His first son tries to murder him. Now, when you're the son of the king and you've unsuccessfully attempted to murder the king, you're not sticking around in the kingdom. He runs off to the Holy Land, fights in the Crusades. He's no longer in the line for the throne. William's second son is killed in an accident, leaving his 2 younger sons heir to the throne, William II and Henry I. William II takes the throne, and history records that William II is an evil, wicked king. Now, William rules for a short while until one day William and his little brother Henry I decide to go hunting together. And William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident. When a stray arrow from his little brother's hunting party accidentally kills him, coincidentally catapulting Henry to the throne. Now you think this is an accident. Well, neither did the people of Great Britain. The bad news is for Henry that when you live in a kingdom and you're not satisfied with the legitimacy of the king, it's not like you start a recall petition or find a candidate to run against him in the next election. When you are a king and the people do not accept your legitimacy to be king, the only option you have is the people are going to revolt and start chopping off heads. Oddly enough, Henry is fond of his head. He starts making promises to the people in order to appease them so he can keep the throne and his head at the same time. The first thing Henry promises is that he's going to marry an Anglo-Saxon woman. Now, the Anglo-Saxons are the majority of the population in Great Britain. Now, his advisors are obviously very astute, because what they figured out is they can appease the majority of the people by giving them representation on the throne. How does that work? Well, if you're Anglo-Saxon and you have an Anglo-Saxon queen on the throne, you have to know that some benefits and privileges are coming your way, right? She's going to make sure that the Anglo-Saxon people are favored above all people. And so the advisors have figured out that we can appease the majority of the population with the expectation of what they're going to get from the government. Henry then promises, I will do an investigation to determine whether I'm at fault for the death of my brother or not. They call it a grand tribunal. How do you suppose that works out when the government investigates itself? Sort of like the Department of Justice investigating Eric Holder or IRS or Benghazi or anything, right? The conclusions are exactly the same. Henry is not at fault for the death of his brother and he is fit to be king. But the people did not believe the veracity of this investigation either. So Henry makes one final promise, the most important promise that Henry's going to make. Henry promises and signs the first document in what I call the genealogy of our Constitution. It took 700 years to write our Constitution, and there are 5 documents that were written over those 700 years that are so important. It'd be just like somebody going in time and killing your great-great-grandfather. You would not be here. Any one of these 5 documents not existing, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, would not look anything like it does. It may not even exist. This first document is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. In this 1100 Charter of Liberties, Henry promises that kings will no longer be evil and oppressive. Ever. Now the interesting thing is, Henry makes a list of 14 things that kings can't ever do ever again, because if they do them, they'll be evil and oppressive. Now I'm sure we could come up with a longer list, but I appreciate what Henry's done, because I think that if a king recognizes that a government is evil and oppressive, that should be something that's a no-brainer for us today, right? He's given us a test. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole 14 things, but I do want to share one of them with you. Henry says, if any of my baron or earls shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Because Henry was remarking that when the heirs of an estate have to purchase their estate from the government before they can receive it, that's an evil and oppressive government. So how is it that a king in 1100, who has no responsibility to the people whatsoever, recognizes that an inheritance tax is the earmark of an evil and oppressive government, and our government simply calls it revenue? Because we don't know what liberty is. And apparently a king knew more about liberty in 1100 than we do today. Now Henry is not interested in liberty, he's interested in keeping his head. But he has signed and sealed this promise that will take hold and be in effect forever. And the people of Great Britain are going to need this in 100 years, because in 100 years they're going to have the most evil king, as history reports, they will ever have. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king. As a matter of fact, if you cannot pay your taxes in John's kingdom, which is highly likely, you are arrested, you are thrown into prison, you are mutilated. He's cutting off hands and feet and ears and tongues for not paying their taxes. And if you're lucky, you're simply executed. They said he was vicious and ruthless. You guys know John, by the way, you probably don't realize it. Ever heard of a guy named Robin Hood? That's the king in the Robin Hood stories. Somebody shout out real quick, what is Robin Hood's claim to fame?
Robbing from the rich and giving.
Rob to rich and give to the poor. Well, that's what we're taught, but it's not true. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich and giving to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive taxation and returning it to the people so they could live. Remember, John is going to murder you if you cannot pay your taxes. Robin Hood is not putting everybody on equal financial footing. He is giving people their lives back. Something else interesting about John's day, murdering people for not paying their taxes was not enough to cause the people to revolt. Because you see, when people only have a prosperity focus, when they're only worried about balanced budgets, when they're only worried about job numbers and what they can get in their hand or what they have in their hand, history proves that in those circumstances with those priorities, tyrants will always be able to trickle down just enough to make you a happy slave. Good news is tyrants always commit a fundamental error. They get power drunk, start thinking they can do anything they want, and the people will not fight back. John's fundamental error is this. The people of Great Britain choose a man by the name of Stephen Langton to be their archbishop. John says, I don't like this guy. I'm going to pick who the head of your church is going to be. But you see, John has already forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties, because the very first promise Henry makes is that the church will be wholly free from government intrusion. That should sound familiar to you. You see, Thomas Jefferson did not invent that principle of separation of church and state. That came from Henry I, when Henry recognized that a government that sticks its nose into your church is an evil and oppressive government. Now, we recognize that as being the first part of our First Amendment, don't we? Are you ready for your first pop quiz? I told you, I'm an educator. All right, so no pocket constitutions, you can't cheat. You can't use your smartphone or your tablet. You can't ask your neighbor, and you can't call for a lifeline. As a matter of fact, I do not want you to answer out loud. I don't even want you to lip sync the answer. Because I want your neighbor to be able to have an honest assessment on whether he knows the answer to this question or not. There are five individual liberties identified in the First Amendment alone. Name all 5. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took this poll. Found out that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. So those statistics, I know there are people in this room who can only name 4. I know there are people in this room who can only name 3, and there might even be 1 or 2 that can only name 2. Now, where you fall in that statistic is your business, which is why I didn't want you to answer out loud. I asked you that question just so I could ask you this one. If you do not know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? You see, we talk about constitutionally protected rights. That's a lie. The Constitution can't protect your rights. The Constitution is a piece of parchment with ink on it. Can the Constitution write your legislator, your representative a letter and say you have to comply with the Constitution? Can the Constitution go sit in your senator's office and demand constitutional compliance? Can the Constitution pick up the sword when they refuse? See, the only defenders of liberty are the people sitting in these seats. Because the Constitution doesn't protect your liberty, it simply recognizes that it exists and sets a visible boundary for the government. A revolution is brought against John, bringing us the second document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the Magna Carta of 1215. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Magna Carta. Raise your hand if you've heard of the 1100 Charter of Liberties before I taught it to you. See, I don't understand that even our best constitutional studies, if they take you beyond 1776, which is rare, they stop at the Magna Carta. But you see, you miss one of the most important steps in the developments of liberty by skipping the 1100 Charter of Liberties. First off, the Magna Carta does not exist without the 1100 Charter of Liberties. But second, you miss this step. Remember who wrote the 1100 Charter of Liberties? It was Henry I, right? Well, a king did not write the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was written by the people. Now, they were the barons, they were the nobles, but the barons are still subjects to the king. They have no rights, no privileges unless the king grants them. They just get better ones because of the class they're in. But you see, what we have here now is the people standing up to the king and saying, you made us a promise in 1100 that kings would no longer be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise. So now we, the people, are going to rise in our majesty above the king and tell him what he can and cannot do. A committee of 25 men is created that will sit in the king's court with the power and the authority to tell the king, sorry, you can't do that because it breaks your promise. No taxation without representation of this committee of 25 men. Clauses 39 and 40 of the Magna Carta are the seeds to our due process clause. Our 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th amendments would not exist without the Magna Carta because we didn't invent them, we inherited them. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta recognizes the right of the people to petition the government of their grievances. That's that 5th one in our First Amendment that everybody always forgets, the right of the people to petition the government of their grievances. So let me help you. I'll help you remember those. You won't forget. So you got freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to complain. That's what that means. You have the right to complain, and the government can't throw you in jail for it. John signs the Magna Carta because he's got a sword in his throat. And the people are going to remove him from the throne less than a year later. But the people now have a promise. But kings being told what they can and cannot do is not going to go over well. So now they're going to have to fight for the next 400 years to maintain their control and get any further advancements in liberty. So let me fast forward you to 1625. The king's name is Charles I. Charles is described as a massive spending king. The history records that Charles, the people call Charles, that he loves to romp about Europe spending on his every whim and fancy. I don't know if they played golf back then, but maybe they did. He was likely involved. Now, whose money is Charles spending? The people's money. How is he collecting their money? Taxes. Well, that committee of 25 men is now called Parliament. Parliament gets fed up with Charles' wasteful spending and tells Charles, we're not passing any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. Charles says, fine, but I'll remind you of something. I'm king. What do I need Parliament for anyway? And he dissolves Parliament. Perhaps he said, where Parliament refuses to legislate, I'll just go ahead and regulate. Maybe he held a State of the Kingdom address and said, if Parliament will not pass laws, I will. After all, I have a quill and a messenger. Charles still wants to get their money, but he can't pass a tax, because kings are learning you can't be too tyrannical too fast. So he remembers as king, he has the power to issue a decree. It's not a law, it's not a tax, it's a decree. And so he collects the people's money through this decree, and he's careful not to call it a tax. He calls it a forced loan. It's not a tax, it's a mandate. 7 knights stand up to Charles and say, we're not enforcing this law, and we're not complying because this is a violation of our constitutional charter. Charles throws them in prison, denies them their due process, and they die there. But a revolution is born, bringing the third document in the genealogy of our Constitution. The petition of right of 1628. A list of grievances against Charles on how he's violated the Magna Carta and broken his promise in the 1100 Charter of Liberties. There'll be no taxation without representation, regardless of what you call it. Yes, we do have the right to due process, but while we're making the list, we're going to add a few more things. Among those things, they say you cannot invoke martial law on us unless we're being invaded by a foreign nation, and you cannot quarter soldiers in our homes without our permission. Because we didn't invent the Third Amendment, we inherited it. Charles signs the Petition of Right the same way John did, with a sword at his throat. And the people don't remove him from the throne. They think maybe Charles has learned his lesson. But Charles has learned that if he's going to spend and steal the money through taxation, he's going to have an excuse. History provides him with that excuse. The years between 1628 and 1641 are very violent times in Europe. And Charles starts collecting the people's taxes and telling them, we have to collect your taxes so that we can fund our allies in these foreign wars. We must fund our allies in these foreign wars, because if our allies do not win, then the enemies will come to us and we will have wars to deal with. We can prevent our own wars by funding our allies. But the people of Great Britain have figured out that Charles is lying to them. He is not funding their allies, he is funding their enemies. Because the enemies want to help Charles take control of Great Britain. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty and sentenced to death. A process that gives us the fourth document in the genealogy of our Constitution. It's called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. Now remember, Dick Durbin wants you to think that we're intellectually superior to these people. But this Grand Remonstrance of 1641 is an amazing document. It says, the root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom. Put that in modern English, they're basically saying, hey, wait a minute now, we've been watching tyrants for 600 years, and we're starting to notice a pattern. The same bag of tricks over and over again, a wicked, evil plan whose only purpose is to overturn and undermine liberty. That wicked, evil plan they identify is corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, diminishing property rights of the people, the government taking control over the church to control the people, creation of fiat money to manipulate the economy, and disarming the people while the government remained armed. Think we're smarter than we were back then? Because I'm thinking we wouldn't be repeating that mistake if we knew it. Do you think this is the last time they're going to have to fight? 40 years later, they have a new king. His name is James II. James II is engaging in the entire malignant and pernicious design all over again. Only James has learned that if you're going to take the liberty of the people, you have to give them something in return. He issues a decree that establishes a type of religious liberty. This religious liberty decree says you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, with any pastor you want, you can preach anything you want, and the church cannot prosecute you. But, the decree says, before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, and you must promise that you will never ever say anything that might even be construed as criticism of the king, punishable by death. That doesn't sound like religious liberty to me. That sounds like a 501c3. James then demands that this decree is read in all the churches. 7 bishops stand up to James and say, we have a promise over 500 years old that says the church will be wholly free from government intrusion. We are not reading anything. James arrests them, throws them in prison, and charges them with seditious libel. Seditious libel says you get your day in court, but truth is no defense. Interestingly enough, 7 bishops who should have died according to the law were acquitted because 2 judges refused to enforce an unconstitutional decree, and the rest of them had juries of their peers that refused to enforce an unconstitutional crime. We did not invent a jury of our peers, nor jury nullification. We inherited it. A revolution is brought against James, bringing us the 5th document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. This English Bill of Rights says, "The late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of our kingdom." That word extirpate means to completely destroy. And what they said James was doing to completely destroy liberty was, he was writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law when that was the sole duty and privilege of the legislative branch of Parliament. We did not invent separation of powers, we inherited it. And apparently in 1689, they knew that when executive orders are written to change law, overturn law, or set aside law, that's the complete destruction of liberty. But our Congress today does nothing. Now tomorrow, we are going to go into this in greater detail. I'm going to explain to you why our Revolutionary War had nothing to do with taxes. We say taxed enough already, but it had nothing to do with taxes, and had everything to do with the malignant and pernicious design. Have you seen how history has repeated itself? Do you think we're smarter now? Have I taught you something today?
Yes.
All right. Well, I do have some things with me today. You saw me reading from this book. How many of you figured out the history that I just taught you is not being taught in our schools? Well, this book is the history that I just taught you, plus chapters for framers and founders, chapters on framers and founders that they won't learn about anywhere else. Middle school, high school, I also have a book that teaches the same thing to elementary and younger. I have an adult version called Not a Living, Breathing Document, Reclaiming Our Constitution. I also have, in case you're not able to attend tomorrow, a 3 DVD set of the workshop that I teach. It's not my husband with a camcorder. It's a professional recording, digitally mastered, chaptered out so you don't have to watch the whole thing on 3 separate discs. I also have a book called Liberty First, The Path to Restoring America. Because when I finish with the workshops, everybody says, KrisAnne, we're ready to go fight. We're ready to get our torches and our pitchforks. What do? That book, the red and white book, Liberty First, is my suggestions, 10 chapters of things that we can do to help restore America back to its founding principles based on what has worked throughout history. And so that's the good news. We have those resources. The bad news is Texas bought me out. So what I have is a mechanism for you to purchase these books at the reduced price. All of my books are available on my website, which is KrisAnneHall.com, KrisAnnehall.com. All of them are available, but some of them have different prices, and you have to pay shipping and handling. So because I don't have enough books, we have a mechanism for you to buy the books today. I fill out a form on my computer, and my husband mails them out to you first thing Monday morning. And you don't pay shipping and handling. I also have a radio show that runs 6 days a week, Monday through Friday and Sunday. On my website, I've written over 100 articles that deal with issues that you probably have questions about today. I have written these 4 books, and I've been approached by a film crew from Focus on the Family to turn my workshop that I do every Saturday into a documentary. So we need your prayers. That's going to be a huge thing. It's going to be shot in 30-minute episodes, and I'm going to be teaching the history where it happened. So where the Magna Carta was signed. We already have contact with the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, and the Learning Channel to see who wants to carry it. So, are you ready to go teach some people?
Yes.
I hope you'll come tomorrow, because it really gets better. I want to thank you guys for bringing me. Thank you for your time.
We have had one of the most excellent programs that we've ever had at High Noon today. We've learned something extremely important. I'll go ahead and sit that down for just a moment, if you would. KrisAnne makes her living by what you folks give her. So we're going to pass the basket or the hat. Where you at, Molly?
The basket's right there.
We're going to use the basket. We're going to pass the basket around the room, and we'll take a couple of questions while we do this. We're just about out of time, but while we're moving the basket around, please do it swiftly, and they can write checks
To me. And let me
to
mention,
KrisAnne Hall.
if you have another group outside this one that you think could benefit from this education, I don't charge anything for what I do. I have no speaking fees, and I don't require travel or accommodation. So there's no cost to your groups to bring me in. All I need is an invitation and a venue.
You're welcome anytime.
Thank
Just let us
you.
know when you want to come
Anytime.
back. Yeah, come on, Joe.
My name is Joe. Thank you so much for your education. I was delighted to hear that you go to high schools and teach young people. If you look out here, most of us are getting a little gray on top.
Think for yourself.
Yes, sir. You have a beautiful head of hair. How do the young kids react to your presentation?
Well, let me tell you something. I am seeing more and more young people attend my training sessions. And last year we did 22 high schools and college campuses. This year we're going to exceed that number in the first 6 months. The high school kids respond differently than the college kids. Obviously, they have a different background. I have had high school boys, who I think are my toughest audience, come up to me and say, "Ms. Hall, you gave me goosebumps. Why can't we have history taught like this in school?" Now, the college students react differently. There's like a spectrum. One young man came up to me and had a debate on living, breathing document. And he left questioning everything that he thought to be true. And that's the best I can ask for. One young lady, now because I teach, I have so much to teach in a very short period of time, I don't let them ask questions while I'm lecturing. But I had one lady who interrupted me. She was pounding on her desk. And I said, okay. She said to me, as she shook both of her fists, clenched so tight that I could see her knuckles turning white. She said, "Why have we been lied to our entire education?" That's the reactions that I get.
All right, well, thank you very much for being here. Has the basket made it around? Anybody have anything else? You have any question? Okay, we're just about out of time. Make it a quick one, please.
One is, repeat your website again, and I missed number 3 in the grand remonstrative of.
Okay, the
You
third
need to buy a
one.
book.
Okay, my website is KrisAnneHall.com, KrisAnneHall.com. Now, the third document is the Petition of Right of 1628. The fourth document is the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. So the third is 1628, and the fourth is 1641. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful program. Thank you so much for coming. We will be back here at noon next week.